My mother died from a drug overdose, and I never met my father. Eventually, I was placed into foster care when I was 10 years old. I was in that awkward stage between childhood and adolescence, making it even harder to fit in. The state placed me in a foster home on the outskirts of the city. The house belonged to a woman named Mona, who was in her late 40s. She ran the foster home with 5 kids, including me. Mona's boyfriend, Marco, often visited. I never liked the guy. His rough face and the huge knife scar on his cheek told me he wasn't someone to trust. Mona seemed fond of him, though. She'd dress up and apply makeup whenever he visited, and they'd go out, returning late at night when we were all asleep.
Among the other kids, my only friend was my roommate, Maria. Her mother had abandoned her on the street, and she was brought into foster care by an NGO. Every child in that house had a tragic past. Mona wasn't affectionate, but she didn't mistreat us either. She'd celebrate all our birthdays on the same day, probably to cut costs. Our rooms were upstairs, while Mona's bedroom was the biggest in the house, located downstairs. One day, Maria and I were playing in the backyard when she accidentally fell from the swing and hurt her leg. I ran to call Mona and knocked on her bedroom door. When she opened it, I noticed the room was covered in vibrant, multicolored wallpaper with flowers and butterflies. The room felt like a different world. Mona went to help Maria, but I stayed behind, entranced by the grandeur of the room. I was admiring the wallpaper when suddenly I heard a woman whisper in my ear, "Help me!" I jumped back, shocked. I looked around, but was alone in the room. Was it my imagination, or had I really heard a woman's voice? "Hello? Is there anybody here?" I asked nervously, but there was no reply. Instead, I started to hear a faint whispering sound. It seemed to be coming from the wall, right in front of me. I moved closer and placed my ear against the wall. "What are you doing?" Mona's voice startled me. I turned around to see her standing in the doorway, looking surprised. "Nothing. I was just looking at the wallpaper." "You have a beautiful room, Mona," I said, trying to hide my nervousness. "Thank you, sweetheart. Come on, let's go. It's time for lunch," she replied. I left the room quickly, feeling awkward. I knew she saw me leaning against the wall, like a crazy person. A few months passed, and 2 kids got adopted. Only Maria, a boy named Tony, and I were left in the house. Tony was younger than us and always followed our lead. One day, Mona was working in the kitchen when a leak occurred under the sink. She called Marco for help. He arrived and started checking the leak. I was sitting at the kitchen table, watching him work. "I think there's a screw that needs to be tightened," Marco said, "but I don't have a wrench." "I think there's one in the basement," Mona replied. None of the kids liked going to the basement. It was dark and had a funky smell. But since Mona was busy and Marco was working, I volunteered to go. I turned on the basement light and slowly descended the stairs. The basement smelled musty, probably because there were no windows or vents. In the right corner, I saw a wooden shelf with the wrench sitting on it. I walked over to pick it up when I noticed a big trunk in the left corner. Curious, I approached the trunk, but it was sealed with a metal lock. "There's nothing but junk in it," Marco's voice startled me. I turned to see him coming down the stairs. "Then why is it locked?" I asked. My curiosity piqued. Marco watched me for a moment, then walked over to the shelf and picked up the wrench. "Come on, let's go! We got what we were looking for," he said, leading me out of the basement. He locked the door behind us. From that day on, I started to realize something was wrong with that place. At night, I could hear voices running through the halls. But the more I tried to listen, the more they faded away. One night, I woke up to the sound of arguing downstairs. I tiptoed to the top of the stairs and peeked down. I saw Mona and Marco having a serious argument in hushed voices. "What are you saying? Are you out of your mind?" Marco hissed. "Look, I'm telling you, this kid will get us in trouble," Mona whispered back. "Don't talk like an idiot. She's just a dumb kid. She'll never guess the truth," Marco replied. "She asked me what was in the trunk today. We have to get rid of it," Mona insisted. "Oh, come on. Did you chicken out because of a kid? Don't you remember how we fooled the cops in California?" Marco sneered. "Listen, darling, there's nothing to worry about, okay? Just relax. I'll keep the basement locked at all times from now on. Happy?" Marco assured her. "Yeah, that'll be better. I'll look for a place to get rid of the trunk soon," Mona said, finally relenting. They went to their bedroom, and I hurried back to my bed, heart pounding. What could be inside that trunk? It was a Saturday night when everything came to light. Mona and Marco were out, and the three of us, Maria, Tony, and I, were watching TV in the living room. Maria suddenly suggested playing hide-and-seek, and we agreed. After a few rounds, it was my turn to find everyone. "Ready or not, here I come!" I called out. I found Tony easily. He was hiding under the bed. But Maria was nowhere to be found. I realized she might be hiding downstairs. I checked the entire living room, but there was no sign of her. The only place left to check was Mona's bedroom, since the basement was locked. I pushed open the door to Mona's room and said, "I know you're hiding in here somewhere, Maria." The room smelled strongly of chemicals, like a hospital. I walked closer to the wall with the vibrant wallpaper. As I touched it, it felt wet and soggy. It was clear that some strange liquid had been applied all over. Suddenly, Maria jumped out of Mona's cupboard, trying to scare me. I dodged her, and she stumbled into the wall, accidentally tearing the wallpaper. As soon as the wallpaper ripped, hundreds of ants and spiders started crawling out from the hole. We were horrified and ran out of the house, screaming in fear. Our neighbor, Mr. Stewart, heard us and came rushing over. He entered Mona's room and immediately called the cops. Within 15 to 20 minutes, police cars arrived. Mr. Stewart spoke to them, his face pale with fear. The cops broke into the basement, and the horrifying truth was revealed. Mona and Marco were convicted murderers who had fled California after robbing and killing several people. They had murdered 6 or 7 victims and found a gruesome way to hide the bodies. The bones of their victims were stored in the trunk in the basement. But that wasn't the worst part. The cops discovered that the wallpaper in Mona's room was made from the skin of their victims. They had skinned the bodies and turned the skin into wallpaper, but they weren't professionals, so they couldn't preserve it properly. The decaying skin had attracted insects, which they tried to drive away with chemicals. As the cops handcuffed Mona and Marco, I stood on the porch with Maria and Tony. Marco looked at me and then at Mona. "I told you that kid would get us in trouble. I should have choked that little brat in her sleep that day," he snarled, his eyes filled with rage. I still can't forget the terror in his eyes when he said how much he wanted to kill me that night. Now, everything makes sense. The woman's voice from the wall, the whispers running through the house. But I can't tell anyone about this. No one would believe me. I'm just lucky I didn't end up as wallpaper on their wall. Story 2. It was a brisk autumn evening when Sarah arrived at the bed and breakfast, nestled deep within the forest. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, greeted her at the door. "Welcome, dear. You must be exhausted from your journey. I've prepared the guest room for you," she said, her voice soft and soothing. Sarah smiled, grateful for the hospitality. The inn was charming, with its creaky wooden floors and the smell of burning wood from the fireplace. It felt like a refuge, a perfect escape from the world. The innkeeper led Sarah upstairs to a room at the end of a long hallway. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a cozy space with a large bed, a wooden dresser, and a single window overlooking the dark forest. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she stepped inside, but she shrugged it off, attributing it to the cool air. "The bathroom is just down the hall," the innkeeper said. "If you need anything, my room is at the opposite end." "Thank you," Sarah replied, watching as the innkeeper's figure slowly disappeared down the hallway. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. The room was too quiet, and the shadows cast by the moonlight seemed to dance on the walls. She felt a strange unease, a sense that she wasn't alone. At first, she tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her imagination. But then she heard it, a faint whispering coming from the corner of the room. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but she couldn't make out the words. Terrified, Sarah sat up in bed and turned on the lamp beside her. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only silence. She glanced around the room, her eyes scanning every shadow, but nothing seemed out of place. Trying to calm herself, Sarah took a deep breath and lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin. Just as she was about to close her eyes, she felt it, a cold, bony hand wrapping around her ankle. She screamed and kicked, but there was nothing there. Panicked, Sarah jumped out of bed and ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, yelling for help, but the innkeeper didn't respond. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the room with their eerie chorus. Desperate, Sarah ran to the window and tried to open it, but it was stuck. She looked outside, hoping to see someone, anyone, but the forest was dark and empty. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing just beyond the trees, watching her. Its eyes glowed with a sinister light, and its mouth twisted into a wicked grin. Sarah backed away from the window, her heart racing. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around her, filling her mind with fear. She covered her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head, taunting her, driving her mad. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the innkeeper rushed in. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. But Sarah couldn't speak. She just pointed to the window, where the figure had been. The innkeeper looked outside, then back at Sarah, her expression darkening. "You've seen him, haven't you?" she whispered. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. The innkeeper sighed, her kind eyes now filled with sadness. "I was hoping you wouldn't. He only comes for those who are lost." Who is he?" Sarah stammered. "The spirit of a man who died in this forest many years ago," the innkeeper replied. "He preys on the lonely, the desperate, those with nowhere else to go. Once he marks you, there's no escape." Sarah's heart sank as the reality of her situation set in. The whispers had returned, softer now, as if they were waiting. The innkeeper stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's only one way to save yourself. You must leave this place before dawn, or he will take you." With that, the innkeeper handed Sarah a small, old key. "This will unlock the back door. Go now, and don't look back." Sarah didn't hesitate. She took the key and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She found the back door, unlocked it, and burst outside into the cold night air. She ran through the forest, the whispers following her, urging her to stop, to give in. But she didn't stop. She ran until the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, and the whispers finally faded. Breathless and exhausted, Sarah collapsed to the ground, the inn far behind her. She had escaped, but the memory of that night would haunt her forever. She never returned to the inn, and she never spoke of what had happened. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she could still hear the whispers, calling her back to the place she had narrowly escaped.